Poppy is the indoor health company. Poppy's breakthrough real-time tracer particle system is used by HVAC and TAP professionals as the most direct and accurate way to measure ventilation effectiveness. Poppy provides all the equipment, training, and support needed to provide your customers with insights on the safety and energy efficiency of their buildings using 15-minute tests. Tests rapidly measure the equivalent clean air rate, including fresh and recirculated air. Building certifications are also available. Learn more at poppy.com. And thank you to Poppy. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Sam Schwartz, the Director of Marketing with AABC, back with another AABC TAP Talk webinar, and I'll be your moderator today. Thanks to all of our members and non-members across the community for participating today, and a special thanks to Poppy Health for supporting this webinar. I have a few housekeeping notes before we get started. If you do have questions for our speaker, please use the Q&A button in your Zoom window, not the chat, and we will feed those questions to our speaker at the conclusion of the presentation. You can submit questions at any time, no need to wait until the end. This presentation is being recorded and will be available for on-demand to AABC members in 1 week. If you have technical issues, please use the chat box to inform the panelists and we will assist you. And then finally, concerning AIA Learning Units, if you are an AABC certified TBE, TPT, please allow 7 days for your CEUs to be uploaded automatically to your portal. Today's session is on ventilation measurement using tracers for control of infectious aerosols. And joining us, we have Sam here from Poppy Health. He is a scientist and entrepreneur specializing in bringing mission-driven, science-forward ventures to market. Sam is co-CEO and co-founder of Poppy Health. Prior to Poppy, he was CEO and co-founder of Meta and an executive at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. He's recognized as Canada's top 40 under 40 and one of Fast Company's most creative people in business. His research has been published in Nature Genetics, Science Translational Medicine, Cancer Cell, and other leading journals, and speaks publicly on innovation. Poppy Health was recently recognized as one of the top 10 most innovative companies in the world by Fast Company. So I'm going to hand it off to Sam now, who's going to take it away and talk a little bit more about ventilation and measurement. Sam?
Great. Just going to switch screens. So I'm excited to be here with everyone. Thanks so much for joining for this webinar. It's an exciting time right now in the ventilation world, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about a new way that actually has been around for quite a while to measure ventilation effectiveness using tracer particles, and the relevance of this in sort of the modern world that's happening right now to understand building health, understand how green your building is, energy usage, and to create infection-resistant spaces overall. So I'm going to go through a couple things today. So first, I'm going to report a little bit about regulation that is expected and coming for ventilation in buildings, especially in the US. The second thing I'm going to go through is measure ventilation effectiveness with tracer particle technology, talk about work that we and others have done to validate this approach as a robust method to measure ventilation and filtration in buildings, and then process and tools. How is this done? What is the process? What does it actually look like on the ground? Then I'm going to go into some case studies and benefits for using this technique beyond just meeting potential new building standards, and then some next steps. And then after that, I'll be happy to take questions. So to sort of set the stage right, obviously we've all just gone through COVID together, and this is one view that many of us are very familiar with, and I think it really sets the stage for the conversation we're going to have today. So in the view that you're looking at right now, it's a restaurant in China in 2020, and many of you will know the story. One individual came to this restaurant, and they were the index case. They were shedding SARS-CoV-2 into the air through their breath, just like we've all learned happens with this particular disease. Their breath was propagated through the space by uneven air distribution, and specifically their breath moved through an air conditioner unit that is in the right of that room and was propagated back onto other individuals in the room who are not infected, who then got infected as a result of this airflow pattern. And sort of this view played out again and again and again through the pandemic until we all got so used to these sort of super spreader events that we took it as the natural state of the pandemic. We no longer even talked about them anymore at some point, or not to a great degree. And of course, at the root of this problem is the root of issues with ventilation in buildings that focus around aspects like non-well mixed rooms. So this is not a well mixed room. The airflow was not even through the space. Breath was not propagated over everyone evenly, and you can see this with the particular individuals who were infected. And then the second thing is some of the air movers and cleaners that we have in the space can obviously affect this. And so this air pattern was driven by an air conditioner unit that pushed aerosolized viral particles throughout the space in the particular pattern that it did. So one of the things that's become clear for everybody is that unlike food, unlike water, in developed nations, air may not be safe to breathe. And I think that this is sort of where we are in society today. Importantly, we are at a turning point. And so in December, ASHRAE announced with encouragement from the White House that there be a new standard created that regulates the ventilation and filtration, or the equivalent outdoor air rate of buildings, so that we don't have pandemics again, so that we can potentially avoid both SARS-CoV-2 infections in spaces like we just saw, as well as other respiratory infections, because it turns out that leading thought is that many respiratory infections, maybe even the majority, actually are a result of airborne transmission. And just to sort of make the case for how important this is, it also turns out that if you look at all cases of disease annually in the world, about 43% of all those cases are upper respiratory infections. So of all the things that humans get sick with, just sort of imagining all of those different types of diseases and ailments, 43% of those are upper respiratory infections. That's 17.2 billion cases annually. And the amazing thing about that statistic is that studies also show, especially a study that was done last year in 10,000 classrooms in Italy, showed that if you can reach a ventilation rate of at least 5 air changes plus, what you get out of that is as much as 83% reduction in COVID transmission or COVID transmission clusters in those particular classrooms. So applying that, obviously, in theory, to the entire population, in principle, you may be able to reduce 14.1 billion cases of infection every year simply by improving air in buildings. So this is obviously a profound statement. It's a huge opportunity. It's one that has been brought into all of our consciousnesses as a result of the pandemic. The fields of infectious disease and aerosol research, as those fields intersect, and environmental engineering have sort of overlapped in this. And what is coming, we hope, is a new standard that can regulate what is at the core of just a huge number of infections every year that reduce worker productivity, affect families, affect children in schools, and all of the things that we saw during the pandemic. So a little bit about this. It's expected, as reported publicly, that the standard will define requirements for ventilation, filtration, and air cleaning system design, installation, commissioning, operation, maintenance, with the goal of reducing the exposure to infectious aerosols, as we saw in that restaurant view. Standard is expected to apply to occupiable space in new buildings, existing buildings. It's also expected this would cover commercial, residential, and healthcare. And it's not expected to address infection by other modes. So, for example, through touch. But we now know the role of airborne transmission routes for respiratory infections, it's come into sort of clear view, and that's what this is designed to address. So this also is expected to align to design guidance that's been published by ASHRAE for education facilities, for example, and we can start to see some of these elements coming together. So what you can see on the right-hand side there is a task list in this particular design guidance document, and you can see some of the aspects. So ventilation verification, testing, adjusting by test and balancers for HVAC airside components, a risk tolerance assessment using a Wells-Riley calculation, which shows you the probability of an airborne infection given room parameters and ventilation filtration rates. And then you can see the types of tasks that would come out of this: HVAC equipment and filtration upgrades, and on. So in October, sort of putting even more emphasis on this, the White House held its first ever summit on indoor air quality that led to the Clean Indoor Air Challenge throughout the U.S. And there has been a movement that has really been driven over the past 3 years in healthy buildings, that you can see ventilation showing up in a variety of places, even starting with the National Biodefense Strategy, all the way through sort of leading institutions in the U.S., Johns Hopkins, Harvard Healthy Buildings Institute, as well as in the UK. There's a document described as infection resilient environments, time for major upgrade. This is clearly a goal now, creating infection resilient environments where people who are in the room don't get sick, even when people who are sick are present and shedding. Okay, so all of that with sort of solid motivation to do this type of work. What are the tools? How might we do this? And how does this compare to things we do today? So one of the things that we and others at Poppy Health have been developing are tracer particle methods for measuring ventilation rates. And what you can see on the screen and what you saw in a video at the start of the talk was a scene where there are tracer particles being released from a diffuser device that is releasing composition containing water, salt, and a little bit of DNA into the air. And those particles are designed to act almost like a proxy for respiratory aerosols. So respiratory aerosols are fine aerosols that we release into the air as we breathe. And they come in a variety of size ranges, from sort of low nanometer level all the way up to 10 microns and above. The ones that we're really thinking about and concerned about here are the ones that stay aloft for long periods of time, potentially many hours. And when we do tracer particle measurements, what we're doing is releasing a similar substance into the air, where we can measure how far it goes, how quickly it's cleared, and quantify how that substance is removed, given the ventilation in a particular space that may comprise filtration, ventilation, mechanical, natural, and other mechanisms such as deposition of aerosols on surfaces. So at our company, we have developed a real-time approach to this that uses sensors to make these measurements. There are other lab-based approaches as well, each of these very effective for making such measurements, and I'm just going to talk about the sensor approach today. So at the core of this, there's a metric, or actually a family of metrics that we're looking to measure. And the one that we focus on is the effective air change rate, which is defined as the air changes per hour for the removal of a particular substance that you want to remove. So for example, respiratory aerosols, and you're looking at the effectiveness of the removal of that particular particle type or contaminant in the air. You can imagine that there would be a range of effective air change rates for a given room for a range of contaminants that you'd find in the air. In this case, we're focused on respiratory aerosols around the 1 micron size, because we know now that there is a peak of respiratory aerosol production when humans speak and sing that is around 1.6 microns. Aerosols of larger sizes at 2.5 microns, 5 microns, 10 microns and above actually persist for less time in the air, so they decay more quickly from the air and they settle faster. And a lot of the longer range risk of airborne infections is mediated potentially in the smaller micron or submicron range. And so a reasonable compromise in if you need to just make a measurement of one particular particle size seems to be one micron, but the field is also converging on this right now. And I know it's in substantial discussion. So the second thing to say here is that the effective air change rate is not necessarily the core metric that we will all end up using potentially after the ASHRAE standard is published. And right now, part of what we're going to look at is recommendations from the Lancet COVID-19 Commission that actually highlight a couple different metrics that could be useful and are being discussed today. So one of them is the equivalent outdoor air change rate, or ACHE. Another one is equivalent flow rate per person. So how much equivalent fresh air is provided in a room per occupant present. And then another way to look at that is equivalent flow rate per unit of floor area. So starting to get some sort of ratio or relationship between people, floor area that they might occupy, and the equivalent outdoor air rate that's available to them. All of these, of course, are designed to capture some replenishment and removal rate of the thing that we want to remove, respiratory aerosols. And just to relate this back to what many of us are used to measuring, the volumetric air change rate, of course, this is calculated in a completely different way. We measure the flow rate at the vents, and we divide that total flow rate over the total volume of air in a space. And we say that's the air changes per hour for a given space. This is based on an assumption of well-mixed rooms, so assuming that the distribution of air is even throughout that volumetric space. And one of the nice advantages of making tracer measurements and measurements of the effective air change rate in a room is we don't have to assume a room is well-mixed. And part of what I'm going to show you today is a little bit of data around this that shows the relationship between these two things and actually shows them to be fundamentally different measurements. And it's argued that, of course, measuring the actual thing that you want to remove, the respiratory aerosol removal rate, that would be the most accurate way to understand the airborne infection risk of a room and how that number might be modified if you make changes to mechanical or natural ventilation or filtration. So there is some Goldilocks zone and target zone that potentially is between 4 and 6 air changes. Again, the field is converging around this right now. One of the things that we've learned, and I'll report a little bit to you today in our data, is about overventilated spaces that we've started to discover, making large-scale tracer measurements of rooms and buildings. But certainly there's underventilated spaces as well. And the clear thing that we want to do is get buildings into that target zone so they're not overspending and overventilating, but they're also not underventilating and creating infection risk. The equivalent air change rate, another advantage of it is you can measure and challenge the filtration that's active in a space. So this could include induct filtration with MERV 13 filters or better, or HEPA filtration that might be present in local floor-based portable air cleaners. And of course, and then it's combining the effects overall of both mechanical and natural ventilation as both mix their effects in a room. It's also sort of worth highlighting that there isn't currently a tracer-based technique for measuring pathogen inactivation technologies. An example of this is UVC or other ways of inactivating pathogens. And we know this is an area that's being actively worked on. So I think we can expect over time there to be a tracer-based technique that actually is able to measure the entire range of both inactivation, particle removal, and other dilution mechanisms happening in a room. So we're looking now at a table from the Lancet COVID-19 Commission, and we can start to see some of the recommendations for this family of metrics that are in place. And we'll look at a couple different bodies and their recommendations in a moment. So here we can see for the volumetric flow rate per volume for a space, they've said that good, better, best is 4 ACHE, 6 ACHE, or 6+. And you can see how this translates into volumetric flow rate and volume per person and volumetric flow rate per floor area. One of the things that's clear is if you measure one of these things, if you have a couple other variables, for example, the floor area of a room or the number of people, it's trivial to do the translation of one metric into all of these metrics. And so what we advocate for is actually making that core measurement, doing that with tracers, so you get a really accurate equivalent air change rate measurement, and then you can translate it into the metric that you care most about, or the one that that will be defined by experts and published as guidance. So we can also see how groups like AIHA have recommended here, very similar. They reported 95% reduction in infections at 6 equivalent air changes, and you can see sort of the ranges that they recommended through the pandemic. Here's the scale that came out of the Harvard Healthy Buildings program, and very, very similar, and by some of the same authors, I believe, for the COVID-19 or Lancet COVID-19 Commission. Ideal is 6 air changes, excellent is 5 to 6. We remember from the Italian schools study that I mentioned that you get an 83% reduction of infections at 5 to 6. So it makes sense that would be excellent. And then we go down to sort of bare minimum at 3 to 4. But there's a lot of heterogeneity in recommendations if you look across the US and what different states have either published officially or sort of mentioned unofficially. Somebody put together a map of what the different recommendations generally have been, from state to state. California was some of the highest level recommendations or most aggressive recommendations, from 6, maybe all the way up to 12 ACH, which is the type of ACH that you will see in clinical circumstances for the control of airborne infections, all the way down to 2 ACH in places like Montana. So one of the things that's clear here is, if the evidence has been compiled by researchers around the world in aerosol fields and infectious disease, and if that evidence is starting to converge, which we believe it is, it's time to define a national standard. That makes sense, and then we can deal with ventilation as it controls infection rates in sort of an even-handed way. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about a little bit now is getting into the tools and technologies. So what I'm showing here are 2 measurements of air distribution that have been taken in an advanced way using tracer aerosols. And what we're looking at on the right-hand side is a single room. So this happens to be a classroom in Northern California. Each one of the blue dots is a nebulizer device, so a device releasing tracer particles. One of the red dots is one of our sensor devices. And what you can see is a quantified exposure rate for tracer aerosols from each one of the blue dots, in this case, indicating the amount of aerosols, potentially infectious aerosols, that would be received by a teacher standing at the front, by students in the lower right-hand area of this room. And what you can see in the upper left is actually a more highly ventilated area. So you can see this really highlights a non-well-mixed room in this particular classroom. And one thing that we learned in this class is when you put an air purifier in, you actually are able to remove the intensity of some of these arrows, or the percent exposure of tracer aerosols. And we also have seen just renovating the HVAC in this particular building profoundly affected these pathways that we discovered, that we call transmission routes. Or transmission pathways in this building. So this sort of shows you part of the power of what you can do with tracer aerosols when you have both the release and measurement capabilities. The second thing that I'm looking at on the left-hand side is actually what this looks like at a building scale. So through the use of DNA tracers, where we have barcodes that are able to tag release locations and even enable us to count individual molecules or particles that are transiting through time and space in a building, we actually have a very sensitive way to measure where air goes and how fast it's cleared, even across floors. And so what you're looking at here is small within room views that you can see the local transmission paths that we discover, as well as floor to floor views. And in part of the technology that's used in these studies, here we use sequencing-based technology. We can decode individual barcodes and count them, because each has its own unique identity. And with that, we can actually know for sure that a particular particle was released on the 3rd floor and made it through to while every other class in the building that we have a monitor device in. So you can see sort of the long range and short range measurements that you're able to make. What we're not inferring necessarily is the routes that these took through the building. These lines are just drawn directly, but you can infer that much of that must have happened through the HVAC system. Okay, so what is the validation of this type of technology, and how can we be confident in the measurements it makes? So the first thing I just want to bring up is a very simple decay graph. So the simplest measurement that we want to be able to make in a room is for the effective air change rate and other equivalent metrics is generating a decay graph for that room. So what this comprises is release of your tracer particle quantity into the air over some time or volume of liquid tracer particle released, and then enabling that to build up, and then watching that decay through whatever ventilation and filtration mechanisms are in place. We care a lot, as I mentioned, about the 0.5 to 1 micron fraction being the aerosols that persist longest. And this decay curve, this is mathematically translatable using simple calculations to the EACH of the room, and then that metric can be transformed into that other set of metrics. So when you start to do this at scale, of course, very labor intensive to calculate all of these decay rates. And one of the things that we have worked on is generating algorithms that can intelligently read particle traces very rapidly that are generated over time and space in buildings to understand the relationship between many locations and the equivalent air change rates that we're seeing given unequal air distribution in spaces, or just get a consensus measurement for an individual space or zone in a building as we've started to define it. So the other thing that we see is people walk by. There are disturbances in the air that need to be accommodated and adjusted for. Otherwise, you have to repeat these types of measurements, which can be totally warranted to get reproducibility. But we've been able to design algorithms that can actually handle the noise and are robust to some of the fluctuations that you see in the environment to reach that consensus or final equivalent air change rate for the space. So how do we validate this approach? We did it in two ways. So the first thing that we did is we actually developed computational fluid modeling of aerosol motion in a simulated environment, so that we could have a completely characterized and completely controlled environment and be able to understand what would the volumetric ACH be for that room, given the air that's coming in through a diffuser vent, for example, or a virtual diffuser vent and being released out of a virtual return vent. And how does that relate to particle concentrations over space and time in the room? One of the questions that you might be asking is, are we making EACH measurements to try to estimate the ACH of the room? And the argument that we and others now make is that no, that's not what we're trying to do. These are two fundamentally different things. And that's actually what we saw in this study. So depending on how well mixed you try to make your virtual space, what you see is ultimately there are detailed positional effects that you can see with the array of virtual sensors that we set up in this CFD model. And depending on how close you are to the inlets and outlets or air concentration points in a room, you will get different particle removal rates, which completely makes sense. Particles are moving around. They are being removed through particular invisible pathways that you can't see in the space. And you can only mix the room so well. And so if you then now look at the graph and you relate the equivalent ACH at each one of those positions to the volumetric ACH, what we see is they are true and fundamentally different things. And it's the ACH that is the proxy of EACH, not the other way around. We then went and replicated this in physical space. We actually built another chamber very similar to the virtual one that we used. And what we saw was exactly the same thing at a variety of induced air change rates. We added fans to create mixing and non-mixed conditions. And what we saw is fundamentally EACH is different than ACH. ACH is a proxy of the particle removal rates in the breathing zone at the floor where people would interact in this office space. And it's clear that measuring the particle removal rate directly is the thing that you want to do. Okay, so what's the process and tools? How do we actually do this in practice? So all of that science aside, which I'm happy to follow up on and have conversations around, that's sort of the scaffolding and framework of this thing. What we're really doing is a fairly simple procedure in rooms, and it comprises defining a zone in a building, which we think of a little bit differently in some cases than an air control zone. In ventilation, we think of our zones here as logical airspaces that look to have some sort of consistency in how the air is treated in that space. Ideally, you'd have some control mechanisms within sort of that zone definition. We will do a triplicate rapid air test, as we call it, using 3 different sensors and a single release from 1 or more diffuser devices, depending on the level of background particles in the space. And with the ACH in hand, which can be measured in about 20 minutes or so, we have the benchmark for that room, the reference number for that room, and then we can understand where are we in that Goldilocks zone. Are we above 6 ACH? Are we below 6 ACH? If we're below, there can be steps taken, including just simple, fast steps like adding a portable air purifier to the room to boost the air change rate, while there might be a longer range project of modifying the recirculation rate or even updating the HVAC system. And if we're above that Goldilocks zone, we can start to work to bring that down. And in our case with Poppy Health, we will often partner with HVAC contractors and others who have the ability to make those changes. In the case of our company, we don't make those changes directly ourselves. And then, of course, there's going through retesting to confirm that the changes made are what were intended, and then periodic retesting to confirm that those changes are stable. So where does this apply to? It applies to virtually any indoor space. So obviously, there is a huge range of buildings out there that you'll find in the market: Class A, B, C buildings. Class C buildings, typically naturally ventilated only, and rely on both natural ventilation and maybe local purification to achieve whatever rate or particle removal rate that will be targeted. Class B buildings may have air conditioners, but won't have sophisticated control over them in sort of the same way that you see in Class A. And then in Class A buildings, we are typically best in class. So we have maybe automated control, inflow in-vent airflow measurements that can help us know what the volumetric flow rate is. But across the board in these buildings, and because of the fundamental difference between volumetric airflow and EACH measurements, it's critical to make the measurement using tracers in the breathing zone, and then use the controls that you have to make changes, regardless of what those controls might be. One of the advantages, of course, with the tracer measurement is that it gives you credit in some sense, or takes into account whatever active and passive mechanisms are present. So it's relevant to a Class C building, like an older school, for example, and it's just as relevant in a Class A building where you have intimate control, maybe even instant control using your BMS system of airflow rates. Okay, so how does this relate to particle measurements that can be done by other approaches and CO2 measurements? So one of the things that I wanted to highlight is the difference between a equivalent air change rate or an ACH rate and what IAQ monitors do. IAQ monitors are great tools for measuring the presence and the presence of particular contaminants in the air that are easy to measure. So none of them will measure the presence of, for example, viruses. That would be great, but they can measure the presence of easily detectable particle fractions like PM2.5 and PM5 particles, usually on a mass basis, which is different and potentially less accurate than particle counting, which is typically done using reference quality devices that are within about 10 to 15% of an ISO certified clean room measurement device or reference counter. So the cheaply available and broadly available IAQ monitors, they're not at that quality, but they can give you a sense of the presence of contaminants in the air that are aerosol particles. They measure VOCs, CO2, temperature, humidity, and sometimes things like argon gas. But what they're not measuring is the change rate in the building. And what we're primarily focused on now is measuring sort of how quickly the building breathes out contaminants and breathes in new fresh air, either through filtration or natural, outdoor air ventilation. And they won't be able to do this for you. The second thing is CO2 monitors, which became really popular during the pandemic, and look like they might be able to sort of get close to the types of measurements that we want to make here. Unfortunately, because CO2 gas is not something that is filterable using HEPA filters or MERV 13s, they aren't able to take into the account the effective filtration in rooms. And of course, this is the most cost-effective way of providing cleaned air to a space. And so while they have their place under certain circumstances, it's clear that they're potentially misleading under others. A really great example of this is what happens if you take a CO2 meter onto an airplane. Airplanes almost always have very effective HEPA filtration. We've used our tracer particle system, for example, on flying airplanes. We've seen fantastic particle removal rates, but if you pair those measurements back to back with CO2 meters, what you see is CO2 levels rise through the time of the flight. You could get really freaked out by those measurements. It turns out, at least for infectious disease, you're very safe through airborne route. Okay, so I'm going to rapidly go through just a couple case studies and then talk about next steps. So why would we want to do these for buildings? So there's a couple clear reasons that I've mentioned briefly already. Save energy, so find overventilated zones and bring them down to that Goldilocks range. Meet best practices, both either at the state level or coming standards. Stay in a green and healthy zone. So if you are not overventilating, but you're not underventilating, you've actually optimized for two major priorities in the built world, one being energy conservation and carbon footprint, the second one being healthy spaces. And frankly, this gives building owners the ability to stand out and promote the safety of their buildings at a time when leases and tenants are questioning whether they should continue renting expensive spaces in commercial office buildings, for example. So these can be important differentiating factors for building owners. There's a variety of statistics available that back up these types of benefits, anything from almost 80% savings on energy costs with safer indoor air strategies, return at the employee level, both in terms of wanting to be at work or do the activities that they have always loved doing in physical space with other people. If you're able to promote your ventilation, we and others have run surveys around these at a fairly large scale to understand workers' opinions. And then, of course, there's these sort of foundational statistics that we're starting to learn about from research. The reduction in infection rates proportional to increasing ventilation rates in buildings, and sort of happy to go into this at another time in more detail with anyone who's interested. One of the things that we saw when we surveyed workers' opinions that really surprised us, and maybe not in retrospect, but we sort of didn't expect it to come out necessarily in the survey, was that more than 2/3 of workers would feel more comfortable at work if their company actually measured air safety, and many of those also said that they'd like ventilation to be third-party verified. And so part of what we've started to see is that there is a role for testing as an independent layer in the market, separate from management and separate from sort of ownership of buildings. And we think that is sort of a really big opportunity for those who do testing of ventilation in buildings. Okay, so resulting, how do you get your data? In the case of our particular system, we provide that in digital dashboards that you can download the data, use it in any ways that you like. We also have available APIs, so our data can actually be connected directly to BMS systems and be used to trigger changes in airflow rates as a result of measurements that we're seeing. And when you look at the data that the tracer particle measurements that have been generated out of our system, for example, how it stacks up across a variety of building types, what we have started to see is that while there is a broad range that you see across building types, buildings are generally either at or above the ventilation rate that we would like to see. And this has been one of the most surprising things that we saw when we started to measure buildings at the scale of hundreds. And I'll tell you a little bit about a program that we ran in Toronto called Breathe Easy Toronto, that to our knowledge was the largest scale survey of ventilation in this way. And so you can see in this particular comparison graph, we go from everything from residential at the low end up to hotel fitness centers with really high air turnover rates. And you can see that there's a clear ventilation reduction opportunity to save money around some of these rates, although critical to making that decision is knowing what the activity type is that's being done in the space and the number of typical occupants, ideally at sort of their peak. And that is something that can be calculated directly using Wells-Riley calculations. So here's what the distribution of scores looks like when you measure 180 locations. This is actually the locations that are found in this graph as well. So you can see that it's across a variety of building classes. And in this case, 84% of buildings were at 4 and above, 75% at 5, 70% at 6, and astoundingly, 9% at 12 and above. And so thinking about sort of like the relevance of this for our downtown cores, this was measured in a city center, for example, it's clear that workplaces are going to be largely safe already. That is not often known by both occupants or even building owners. They know they've put filters into effect, but may not know how effective they've been. The tracer particle measurement technique is one that you can use to illuminate this basically in 20 minutes for any room. Here's another case study that I wanted to show. And here we're looking at the gains that you can see as measured using tracer particles with HVAC updates, as well as just simply opening and closing the doors. So in this school, we have 10 classes that were measured and scans were done using our technique, both doors open, doors closed, before and after HVAC updates. And without going through sort of all the numbers, you can see that after the updates, they got into a range that we'd like to see, sort of 3, 4, and above for these classrooms. But if they closed the doors, they had a dramatic reduction in the EACH for those rooms. And in fact, just having a policy at the school of running their classrooms with the doors open where possible gives you a gain of 2.7 EACHs, which is significant given the data that we've already looked at. And here's another study of an office space. So initial tests, you can see some of the conference room, employee lounge below the target of 4, where we'd like to get to, retested after mitigation. All of their locations were above. We ended up with a 7.8 in reception, and that was able to be brought down into sort of that Goldilocks range. They're not overspending, they're not underventilated. This is a green, healthy space. And maybe I'll just touch on sort of finally in a bank. Here are 3 different branches. Branch ABC. They actually showed, examples of in range, below range, and above range. And in this case, there's both opportunities to lower the overventilated spaces down from the 18.5 EACH that we saw in branch B, and then increase just using portable air purifiers, where we saw 2.4 in one of the branches. And what's great about the tracer technique is this is a technique that you can make these measurements quickly at scale. And in the case of bank branches, for example, major financial institutions will have hundreds or even thousands of locations across the country. It is possible in a relatively short period of time to scale this out to thousands of locations, which is something that we've started to look at. Okay, so next steps. We've talked about a lot today, and would be happy to take questions in a moment. Feel free to get in touch with me. I'm sam@poppy.com, or you can visit our website. If you'd like to dig further into technical data about tracer particle approaches, validation, and benchmarking, how to get access to training around this. So we're launching a professional accreditation program where you can get trained to use these kits and can rent kits directly, so you can start making these tracer particle measurements for your clients. we have available customer brochures, case studies, everything that you'd expect, and we're launching an ROI calculator, so you can directly calculate the cost savings opportunity for customers if they reduce ventilation, in particularly over ventilated spaces. And we'd love to hear from you if you have any other feedback and questions. So with that, I think I'll stop, and Sam, if there's any other questions that you're seeing in the chat, be happy to address them.
Sure. Thank you so much, Sam. One question from our member came in, and they were curious about, can you explain cubic square feet measurements in the analysis of aerosols and particles? And they mentioned that sometimes outdoor air supply is contaminated to HVAC systems, and mentioned a few other variables.
Sure. So briefly, the cubic square feet measurement that has typically been used assumes sort of clean air coming in without additional calculation. So clean air flow rate from your vents, and then just simply divides that over the total volumetric area of the space. Now, it's a really good point that depending on particular geographies, especially, for example, in wildfire geographies, your outdoor air may be less clean than your indoor air. And in the case of making tracer particle measurements, you may need to fight your tracer particles above that background rate. And so one of the critical first steps in making these measurements is understanding what that background level is for the particle fraction or the particle size that you care about, for example, 0.5 to 1 micron particles, and then releasing sufficient particles from your tracer liquid into the air so that you exceed that ideally by about 10-fold, and then you'll be able to have a sufficient decay period to be able to make a reliable EACH measurement. So I think to the point of the question, the circumstances of each room, building, and geography will vary, but this particular technique is robust to many of those circumstances, with some basic judgments that can either be done in an automated way using algorithms, or can be done by hand.
Okay, thanks, Sam. Next question was, what about using tracer gases instead of particles? Is that a good way to measure as well?
So tracer gas is a great, if not often used, way to make these types of measurements. But unfortunately, tracer gas, like CO2, is not filterable. So again, going back to our comments on CO2 meters, because they aren't able to take into account the effect of filtration, either your MERV filters or HEPA filters, you will understand the removal rate of air, but what you won't understand is the clean rate if filters are in effect. So there's an ASTM standard that you can look up for tracer gas decay measurements, and this has been published for some time, I think since the early 2000s. Moving that type of technique into the use of particle measurements or tracer particle measurements really is the forefront that is most relevant to understanding respiratory particle removal.
Great, thank you. And then I have another question from a member that came in asking about the installation of this as a permanent fixture integrated into the building automation system for fan and economizer control. Anything about integrations, would love to hear about.
Yeah, it's a great question. So for those Class A buildings that have automated control systems, it's definitely feasible to install these types of hardware into rooms to make regular tracer release and decay measurements for a given zone. And of course, installing many sensors, many nebulizers in some sort of hidden, not too obvious way that doesn't sort of wreck the aesthetics of a room. What you're able to do is actually also measure aerosol transit over distances and get some of those spatial views of airflow patterns and transmission paths. So that's something that we have done. We have customers in a couple different states who have installed versions of our system. It's certainly more burdensome to do the installation to sort of set that up, but the value is definitely there, given that the data can be consumed by a BMS system. We would say, though, for really scaling this out across large portfolios, probably what you want to do is use rapid test-based measurements for the majority of zones and buildings. For key zones, you could do, which would be a minority, you could do installations And then you'd want to make repeated measurements over a 6 month or 1 year time frame to understand measurement stability for at least the group use spaces. And that's sort of the calculus of how we think about the application of these technologies over building patterns internally.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sam. And let me just quickly check if Sam's back on. Perfect. So to talk about the any other questions that are in? Just give me 1 second. Do we have any more questions that you have in mind?
Not for me, but again, happy to answer questions directly over email or even set up a meeting. I'm sam@poppy.com. Feel free to get in touch.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sam. To everybody else, thank you so much for joining today. We do have the upcoming CX Energy 2023 that's going to happen on May 3rd to May 5th. And specifically focusing on the test and balancing session, the seminar that we have for CXAs, energies, and TAP professionals. We do have 30 plus more sessions that would be taken care of at CX Energy that is led by top industry experts. And then we also have pre-conference training, educational opportunities. And the new thing that we have now is $99 for all access pass for government officials, code authorities, and institutional building owners. So if you think CX Energy is a place that you can network, learn, connect with the experts, everyone, just make sure that you go ahead to www.cxenergy.com. And thank you so much for joining today. Sam, thank you so much for that amazing presentation. We had a lot of interactive comments, and I can see a lot of questions that have come in too. Again, thank you so much. You all have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.